Hi and welcome to the Stefan Livera podcast, a show about Bitcoin and Austrian economics. Today for episode 170, my guest is Yuri de Gaia, partner at L2B Global and doing OTC trading at Bitcoin Reserve. This show is brought to you by Kraken, one of the world's leading Bitcoin exchanges. They're one of the largest, they offer some of the best liquidity available, they are one of the longest standing exchanges, and they are consistently rated the best from a security standpoint. Kraken offer 24/7 support and it's really easy to sign up with them. They also offer Kraken Pro mobile app, delivering all the security and features you love about the Kraken exchange in a beautiful mobile-first design. Kraken also offer margin trading up to 5 times and futures up to 50 times leverage. Go and sign up at kraken.com. Next up is Unchained Capital, Bitcoin financial services. The team have been driving people to try out multi-signature before the halving. If you're bullish, you want to try and improve your security, and Unchained Capital make it really easy for you to do this with this multi-signature vault. It's a 2 of 3 multi-signature setup. You can use Trezor and Ledger, and Coldcard is coming soon. They've also got some really cool updates coming on the open source side with Caravan, which I'm sure I'll be getting the guys on soon to show you that also, so keep an eye out for that. And if you want some liquidity, if you want USD, you can put up some Bitcoin. It's stored on-chain in dedicated multi-sig addresses, and you can receive USD. Unchained Capital also have incredible content on their blog and on their website, so go and learn more at unchained-capital.com. Next, Swan Bitcoin. The dollar cost averaging revolution is rising. More and more people are looking for ways to stack Bitcoin without manual processing. If you are in the US, you must look up Swan Bitcoin at swanbitcoin.com. You can link any major US bank account via ACH and just auto buy Bitcoins, weekly or monthly. Swan Bitcoin also have a focus on education and Bitcoin advocacy. They're really trying to get customers to hold their own Bitcoin private keys. I'm an advisor and I have a small equity stake also. Swan Bitcoin are the cheapest for dollar cost averaging. And there's also a recent episode with Corey, so go and check that out. Finally, just go to swanbitcoin.com for your automated Bitcoin stacking. So Yuri de Gaia, he's a partner at L2B Global, the entity behind Bitcoin Reserve, which is an OTC service, Liquiditi, a service for swapping into L Bitcoin or LBTC, and also Moontower. So in this episode, we talk about Bitcoin's two economies. We've got this regulated, compliant world, and then there's the defiant, crypto-anarchist world. And how will they grow? Do they support each other? And how does this all play into this idea of citadels and monarchy and anarcho-capitalism? So here is the interview. Yuri, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks, Stefan. Glad to be here.
So Yuri, I know you have been doing a lot of interesting stuff in the Bitcoin space. You're working primarily as like an OTC trader, but also doing some writing, and you've got Bitcoin Reserve Journal. So I think it'd be interesting to get into some of these ideas around what are Bitcoin's two economies. And I know you're also a Citadel addict, So tell us a little bit about how you got into doing Bitcoin OTC.
Yeah, well, that was pretty much as soon as I got into Bitcoin, late 2012. So I learned about Bitcoin from the local meetup group in Vancouver. There was literally 6-7 people attending weekly at that time. So it was an interesting time. And I learned a lot from these people. But then I'm a practical person, so I just wanted to see what I can do with it practically. And it just turned out that I was asked for some Bitcoin from someone who didn't have them. And I didn't have a lot on me, so I saw an opportunity basically to just buy a little bit and resell it to that person at a slight markup. And, worked really well. And I was like, well, there's an opportunity there. And, I started doing a little bit of that. And as time went, interest grew, obviously, and especially after the first halving. And then we started getting larger requests. And I was thinking about leveling up, essentially. And, cash transactions, they are tricky in that, cash is it's difficult to handle, and you never know who you deal with. So I wanted to get into, so to speak, a white side of the business, right? So I started doing OTC with the Binary Financial, one of the larger brokers out there. And at the same time, I got into the retail space by launching a Bitcoin ATM business. in Vancouver, which right now is pretty large in Canada with over 75 kiosks across the country. So that was a lot of fun, and I learned a lot from both from this retail space and high net worth space as well. And at some point, I just decided to branch off and start my own company, which is what I'm doing right now with OTC brokerage. When it comes to OTC, there's different types of OTC deals out there. What I do is mostly help individuals and corporate clients buy and sell Bitcoin on a pre-funded basis. So that is the type of deals that I engaged in.
Awesome. You're talking about OTC, and there is, in the Bitcoin world, you could argue there's almost two spheres of influence, right? We've got this whole regulated KYC white market world, and then we've got on the other side, the more defiant black market or gray market crypto-anarchist world. So can you tell us a little bit about how you're thinking about those two different spheres?
Yeah, sure. So essentially, the compliant part of the market is what's represented by on and off ramps, such as Bitcoin exchanges and brokerage houses, OTC desks. This is essentially any business that has to do with fiat and Bitcoin at the same time. Those businesses are what I like to call them bridges between the two worlds, the world of Bitcoin and the world of fiat. And because they have to touch fiat in terms of banking transactions, they have to abide by the rules of the fiat world, which is, as you may know, KYC and AML laws and regulations. And those are pretty strict and they change over time and they get stricter and stricter. And the problem with that is that a lot of the time, regulators don't really know how to deal with certain transactions with certain situations. And what they decide to do is just, they see any problem as a nail and they just act as a hammer. And they decide to impose draconian regulations, which result essentially in the suffering of regular people and regular businesses who don't really want to do any shady transactions, don't engage in any money laundering activities, right? So they suffer from that. Now, the other side of the coin is the defiant economy, as you called it, or non-compliant economy. And by that, I simply mean the economy that operates only on Bitcoin. So it's pretty much the proverbial circular economy that we dream about, where your revenues are in Bitcoin or your expenses are in Bitcoin and you pay your suppliers in Bitcoin. And this is this magical world that we really want to happen. But we all know that right now and probably in the long run, Bitcoin is going to be volatile. So at some point, you have to interact with the fiat world, right? So that's why I think the compliant economy is still a lot bigger than the non-compliant economy, simply because players on the market have to exit and enter the Bitcoin economy all the time, right? But it's definitely interesting to see how the circular economy will develop, especially with various derivative markets where you will be able to hedge your Bitcoin and essentially lock the value of your Bitcoin so that you never have to exit the Bitcoin economy into the fiat world, right? As far as I know, some companies who do need to exit, they just do it very minimally, with to say some deals like for hosting services, VPS, graphic designers sometimes who don't accept Bitcoin, they just need to pay in fiat. But those are not difficult problems to solve. You can easily do that with cash-based transactions, for example, just exchange Bitcoins into cash and pay in cash, or exchange Bitcoin for a small amount in a bank transfer and just pay like that. So yeah, those are the two differences between them, and I don't think they are fighting each other. These two economies, I think they coexist and they will coexist for a long time. But the long game for us Bitcoiners, of course, is to drive out the fiat economy and just absorb all of it into this Bitcoin world where we can just interact with one universal sound money.
Yeah, that sounds definitely very appealing. And it's quite frustrating for many Bitcoin people when they have to interact with the regulatory compliance world, because in many ways, it's almost like the state turns businesses into part of their own surveillance and it makes them do their own bidding. And that can be unsettling for Bitcoiners because, for example, the state will say, okay, you must comply with this X, Y, and Z AML or sanctions rule. And as part of that, you have to do X, Y, and Z invasive questioning on your customer to know what are they spending and who is it to and where did they get this money from. And in some cases, it's also that the government laws and rules specify certain things. Like, for example, in the AML parlance, there's a term known as tipping off, theoretically, and so you're not allowed to disclose to the customer why they are under suspicion, and so then it makes the business then start reporting off to the government about on uh, transactions above a certain threshold, known as threshold transaction reporting, or and then there's also suspicious matter reporting, or suspicious reporting as well. So, do you have any reflections there on that tension that the government regulation creates between Bitcoin companies and Bitcoin users and customers?
Well, yeah, for sure, because if you look at it, even from the broker's point of view, especially in terms of high net worth brokerage, then all transactions are pretty much large sizes. And in a lot of countries, these AML guidelines require you to report any transaction over $10,000 of value, right? So that's pretty much every single client being reported to the government simply for the fact of transacting and deciding to buy or sell Bitcoin, right? So that creates a little bit of mistrust because this is a lot of information, private information that is being sent to the government, and we don't know what they do with it. Maybe they just collect it for, further analysis. Maybe they monitor every single Bitcoin user. We don't know what they're going to do with that company. But what I know is that there are players on the market who decided to take advantage of this desire of the government to spy on Bitcoin users, right? And they created a service around that. The service is called blockchain analytics, and that's what companies like Chainalysis, Elliptic, and others engage in. So essentially, they realized that the government has this desire of monitoring every single transaction. They want to know where the money moves and who moves that money. So these companies came up with certain heuristics in terms of determining who the owner of the coins is and where the coins are moved. And they managed to convince the governments and law enforcement agencies that their heuristics are usable and they should be used by those agencies, right? So they sell these services to them. It does not really matter whether these heuristics are correct or incorrect, whether the service works or doesn't work. What matters is that if the government decides that they are correct, it means that everybody has to suffer because of that decision, right? Because suddenly, if the government says, well, this transaction has originates from a gambling website 5 hops behind, right? So this person who is connected to this transaction may be suspected of illegal gambling activity, for example, right? And suddenly, everybody who deals with such persons is already in a tricky position. Should they deal with him? Or should they not, right? So this definitely creates some tension. So I really like to see where this is going. And one of the interesting technologies that's being developed to combat this is CoinJoin, as you may know.
Yeah, and that's the interesting point there as well that you mentioned some of these Bitcoin surveillance companies basically try to market themselves to government and say, "Hey, look, you need us." And there's also an interaction there in terms of big business prefers lobbying the government than competing in the marketplace in certain scenarios. So, can you expand on that idea? How do you see that playing out? Is this an area where you see that playing out?
Well, definitely. I think the main argument here is that you need to understand that all these big businesses in Bitcoin are founded and operated by individuals who come from traditional finance backgrounds. And if you are born in a traditional finance environment, then by default, you like that system. You like playing within that system, and you realize that any access to government officials may bring benefits to you personally and to your company. So that's why these businesses like to create different consortiums and pursue various lobbying activities within different governments so that they can see various laws passed. Obviously, everything is wrapped around, customer protection, as it's usually done. But at the end of the day, it's the old game of crony capitalism where people create laws that benefit them. The big business scratches the government's back, the government scratches the big businesses' back. And it's not different in Bitcoin either. That's why I think in the non-compliant economy, there will appear large businesses that will be able to fight back, or at least not fight back, but simply ignore these things because they accumulate, financial weight essentially to just not care about these types of situations.
Yeah, those are great points. And to add to that, there's also just the physical meat space risk. So if you are an entrepreneur, you're starting a Bitcoin business, and you are a publicly known name, then you have risk to your person as well, that you can't just shrug that off. That if you were to, because basically your options are either comply with the regulation, shut down the business, or go the underground pathway of not complying. And anyone who tries to take that underground not complying pathway does risk getting, physically attacked or, locked away in a cage and so on. So that is ultimately, I guess, the meat space risk that any public name Bitcoin entrepreneur faces. And so that is also another sort of angle, and that's part of the difficulty. And I suppose that is why some individuals in the space operate under a pseudonym only.
Precisely, and that's why us being public figures, we have to just play within the system and play by their rules, and we have to run our companies and follow these KYC AML guidelines. We can shitpost about them all day long, but it doesn't matter, right? We have to still follow if we want to keep operating. The way I see it is that while it's not very convenient to do so, we still provide a valuable service to people who want an on-ramp to the Bitcoin economy, right? So while it's still possible for people to actually come to us, send us money, and get a load of Bitcoin, we will do everything we can to make that happen, because I believe that right now there still needs to happen more decentralization of UTXOs, if you will. More hands need to have Bitcoins, because right now, especially with larger custodians out there, some people sit on huge piles of Bitcoins just waiting to be hacked one day or stolen in some way. And our job as the on-ramp is to help decentralization of that. At the same time, as you mentioned, there are these anonymous or pseudonymous entities out there who create quite valuable services. Samurai Wallet is one of the examples. They're creating a CoinJoin wallet that allows people to mix their UTXOs. And most of these guys are anonymous as far as I'm concerned. And the thing with them is that because they are a Bitcoin only business, they don't really care about regulations much, because they don't really interact with the fiat world. And as I mentioned, if you don't interact with the fiat world, you don't need to follow much of the regulation. You don't have bank accounts, you don't use dollars, you only accept and spend Bitcoin in your business operations.
Yep. And the question of scale. So might be one thing to be a 100% no fiat business, but it might arguably be the question there around if somebody wanted to buy a certain amount of Bitcoin above a certain size, they are naturally just going to have to go towards the regulated economy for now until the Bitcoin only non-compliant defiant world grows a little bit. So what's your thought there on people that trade-off of who want to be able to buy a certain amount of Bitcoins at scale versus the tension of people wanting, say, more privacy or to operate in the non-compliant world?
Yeah, well, I think all of these things will develop with time. We just need to be patient because Bitcoin is only 10 years old. It's a very new technology. One would argue it's still experimental and you shouldn't play with it too much, right? uh, the biggest scare for people is losing their private keys, right? But technologies in terms of privacy and scaling are already happening right now. CoinJoin that I mentioned just a moment ago is one of those technologies. For scaling, the Lightning Network is already it's not just a separate technology; it's its own industry already with its own conferences, right? So yes, it's a bit clunky right now, and it requires some manual setups, and sometimes things fail. But you can consider these technologies as Bitcoin in 2011, 2012, where things are not very convenient. So let's wait for another 5 to 10 years. I think it will be faster than 10 years. One Bitcoin year is 10 fiat years, right? So uh, essentially, things are developing very fast. So with new technologies coming up like Schnorr signatures, Taproot, we'll see a lot more development in the privacy space as well, and all kinds of new types of transactions. So these things are being developed, and I wouldn't really worry about them right now. I would argue that the average consumer does not care about these things.
Yeah, yeah. And one other, I suppose, risk that's worthwhile talking about from the compliant world is hypothetically, if an exchange is a upfront, publicly known business, the government can easily or more easily go and demand from them, hey, give me a customer list and show me where did those coins go? When they did a withdrawal from your exchange or from your service, where did those coins go? And now I'm going to try and use that to basically go for taxation on those individuals. That is a risk that people face, right?
Yeah, that's correct. And I think these cases have happened in the past, and some exchanges decided to succumb to such requests while others decided to challenge them. I think Kraken was one of those examples that decided to challenge such a request, right? So props to them. But these things will happen more and more often, and we'll just have to be ready for them. And um, I'm not really sure how we can actually fight them because if you are a multi-billion-dollar company, obviously you can hire an army of lawyers and fight off these risks. But if you're a more or less small brokerage firm, even like us, we're quite lean, then we probably don't want to fight them off and piss them off even more.
Yeah, yeah. So turning now to the more kind of defiant world, the non-compliant world, people who want to say operate in this circular Bitcoin economy, they will have to deal with the volatility because it's difficult to price things directly in Sats while the price is moving around a lot. Correct. And I guess the other thing is there can be some difficulty in getting Bitcoiners to give up their sats if they are fundamentally bullish. Well, it's kind of difficult for them to do that too. So, how do you think people will try to deal with that? Is that maybe one good example here is something like BitMEX, the exchange, right? Because they're Bitcoin in and out only, and yet they still have trading on there. But you theoretically have a way of going back to fiat theoretically in a in a synthetic sense, while still obviously there is custodial risk associated with that, but it's hypothetically something that someone can do to try and go back to synthetic USD. Is that a strategy that you see, or do you think it's more just like it just takes time for it to build out over time and people will just still directly price things in sats or use US dollar but use Bitcoin as the rail?
Yeah, well, right now, as you can see, the price of Bitcoin is starting to move up again. So definitely, when you price things in Sats, then your offer grows up in price with Bitcoin. So people usually use APIs just to connect to some kind of a price feed and essentially price it in US dollars or in local currency and transform that into Sats. And it's very understandable. At the same time, there are businesses who are 100% Bitcoin. There are also individuals who live 100% on Bitcoin. They don't have any fiat. So somehow they manage the situation. As far as I understand, while they don't touch most of their Bitcoin holdings because it's just their long-term stash, they have a little bit of an allocation that they may short on BitMEX, for example, thus creating this synthetic US dollar that they can use anytime they want, right? They do pay with Bitcoin, but they have a little stash that keeps its value in terms of US dollars in perpetuity. Uh, well, less some fees that they pay to the exchange for this service, right? So I think it is possible, and with more and more liquidity in the economy, it will be easier to achieve. What I'm looking forward to is the alleviation of this custodial risk by the creation of peer-to-peer exchanges, peer-to-peer derivative places like BitMEX, but on sidechains like Liquid, for example. And there are firms that are already working on peer-to-peer derivatives. So it will be really great to see such things appear because suddenly you have Bitcoins in your own possession and you can still hedge the risk of volatility, right? So that gives you a lot of power. With enough liquidity, you really don't have to worry about fiat money anymore, and people can just accept Bitcoin without worrying about volatility either.
Right, right. And so in that world, so let's say hypothetically somebody is using Tether on Liquid, or somebody is using, LCAD as an example, or one of those things. I guess the way some people might think though is, isn't that just pushing the custodial risk back one problem, because now you're just trusting then that there's enough, let's say, like Canadian dollars backing the LCAD, or that Tether has enough US dollars backing their Liquid USD Tether, right?
Yeah, well, when you talk about so-called stable coins, which are essentially fiat tokens that are backed by a fiat balance in someone's bank account, then definitely such a risk exists. It's out there. And sometimes it's even impossible to audit the reserves of such a company. So, for example, Tether has had a lot of bad press, even though it has not been proven that they may or may not be insolvent, people still talk about it. So that's why, it's traded, Tether is traded slightly off 1 to 1, just a little bit, because there is still a little bit of a risk. But so far, we can see the confidence in Tether is pretty high because it's pretty much on par with US dollar. But what I talked before was more of a synthetic US dollar where there is no cash balances on anybody's bank accounts. It's simply created by creating a derivative contract and essentially shorting Bitcoin. So this is what the BitMEX's perpetual USD contract is. It's a synthetic dollar in terms of its value. You don't really have any dollars in your bank account, but the value keeps pegged to the dollar value, right? So it's even I don't understand fully how derivative markets work. I don't have traditional finance background, but I understand this much, and I think even with this much, there is a lot of potential out there for people who want to exit the fiat world completely.
Right. And so I guess, as you're saying, they would keep most of their stash in Bitcoin, but then let's say their day to day spending amount, that would be where they might keep some in this float, let's say, and that's where they're using, like, in this hypothetical example, something like BitMEX 1x short, which is kind of equivalent to just keeping it a Bitcoin amount that is stable in US dollar terms. That's probably the way to summarize that. Yeah. Okay, and in terms of the two worlds, are there other ways that we could see attention? So a quick example here might be something like, let's say in a few years' time, we in the Bitcoin world want to move to Schnorr aggregated signatures upgrade, right? So not the current Schnorr Taproot fork, but the potentially in the future, that idea. Could something like that get blocked by the KYC compliant world? What's your view there?
Well, they will certainly try. I don't doubt that, as some people say, the next wars are the privacy wars in Bitcoin, the scaling wars being behind. But with the decentralization of Bitcoin capital, decentralization of Bitcoin development also happens, right? So there have been a few articles about how Bitcoin development is funded and how it's distributed in the world. Um, it's not a really bright story in terms of optimism, because there is a little bit of a pessimism in terms of the amount of developers working on Bitcoin core and Bitcoin protocol in general. However, I think that due to an increase in amount of Bitcoin developers and the fact that a lot of them are anonymous, uh, this will be very difficult to pull off. At the end of the day, you may or may not force a Bitcoin developer or even the maintainer himself to merge a certain commit into the code, but you will not be able to force the users to upgrade to that version of the code and run their full nodes with that code, right? So Bitcoin developers are the servants of Bitcoin, just like miners are the servants of Bitcoin. And it is the users who decide what happens and what does not happen on the protocol level, which was very well demonstrated with the previous fork wars and the scaling debate and the UASF movement.
Right. And I think the other important factor there is this concept of economic weight. So hypothetically, some nodes are worth more than other nodes. So hypothetically, Coinbase holding a lot of Bitcoins, their node holds a lot more quote unquote economic weight. So if they hold a lot of Bitcoins and it's a lot of people are just not self-custodying, then potentially that's a vector as well that say Coinbase is more or whatever. Like it's not about Coinbase; it's about whatever big custodial exchange. If they face pressure from the government saying, "Hey, we don't like this upgrade, don't go with it," then that's potentially an angle there for conflict.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not sure if it's entirely correct to say that their node holds any money, because I'm sure that most of their funds are in cold storage and most likely in a
True, true.
multi-sig wallet, right? The node being, well, for the most part, a hot wallet in many places, right? Um, but you are correct. Some of these players may exhibit such behavior. It has been done before, and it will happen again. So we will only have to see how anti-fragile Bitcoin is long term. And so far, I've been optimistic, and I have no reason to believe that this will be otherwise.
True, true. Yeah. And I think there I was referring more to the idea of their node being able to reject an incoming payment that they don't agree with. And let's say that payment is coming from a node that does want aggregated signatures in this hypothetical example, right? But another interesting one is around. So we've got these two different worlds. Which one do you think newbies are more, new coiners are more inclined to join?
Well, I really want to say the non-compliant one, but at the same time, I would be naive to say that, because most people are really followers, and they just follow the general program, so to speak. So they'll just go with whatever is easier, whatever looks sexier, whatever is easier to use, right? User experience matters a lot to the average user. So I would say the uh, companies that are popping up right now, and even Coinbase itself, will still be those companies that lead the way in terms of so-called mass adoption. Yeah, but there will definitely be a wave of users who will take a little more time to study the topic a little more deeply and learn about self-custody, learn about privacy protections. So they will prefer the second type of the economy eventually, because once you understand the full potential that Bitcoin can provide you, you just can't resist really and just go back to the fiat world and participate in their fake economy.
Right. And we've got these two different worlds, there's two economies. Does it matter if only one side works, and do they benefit from each other existing?
Well, yeah, I think it's a synthesis right now because, like I said, a lot of the movement still happens in and out of the Bitcoin economy, and that's where these on and off ramps excel. No matter how much laws and regulations there are, people will still use them, and there are large institutions waiting for specifically that for a super regulated, over regulated entity that can provide them an entry into the Bitcoin world and maybe even custody Bitcoins for them. But it doesn't matter, they still exist. So I think these two economies will be complementary for a long time. Um, when we achieve our Bitcoin utopia, where Bitcoin is the only currency in the world, it will be a happy day. But the word utopia already has this connotation of maybe it's not going to happen.
That's right. And another, well, I guess arguably we could say Bitcoin, the compliant world, benefits from the existence of the non compliant world because it's almost like the existence of that gray market Bitcoin is some kind of evidence that there really is sensor resistance and there really is seizure resistance to Bitcoin. And that kind of adds to the overall value of having this money that is outside any government's control or outside any one company's control, right?
Yeah, well, I think the mere existence of Bitcoin affects how the fiat economy develops as well and the tools that the fiat economy uses. For example, we have actually seen quite major improvements in the banking system over these last 10 years. I still remember just 10 years ago, a wire transfer would take, 3, 5 business days to clear. Right now, it's almost the same day every time we use wire transfers because they can see how, first of all, private companies like PayPal or TransferWise can do it much faster, so they have to compete with those. But they also see that people really love the idea of transferring large amounts of value across the globe instantly and with minimal fees. So they are trying to uh, compete as much as they can. So, there's benefits both ways.
Right, and the optimist in me might say, "Well, look, that's making it easier and easier for people to onboard into Bitcoin. They're making these, Swift GPI or whatever things that will speed up the transfers that allow more people to buy into Bitcoin when they are ready, right? Because obviously everyone has their own time frame on which they are ready. And speaking of making the world ready, we also need citadels. I know you are an advocate of the Bitcoin Citadel idea, and you have spoken a little bit about rootless men of the world having our own nation. So, what are you getting at there?
Well, in terms of the rootless man, I talk primarily about how I feel about myself because I come from Russia and then I spent quite a bit of my life in Canada and I currently travel as well. So you may argue that I'm not really attached to any particular jurisdiction. I don't want to become a digital nomad for the rest of my life because that's not my intention. But also, I don't feel like I have very deep roots in any particular jurisdiction. So this led me to think that there are other individuals in the world who are like that. So we're not connected in terms of our ethnicity or nationality or anything like that, but we may be connected in terms of shared values, shared culture, the way we think about life in general and tradition, right? So why not get together and create these communities where shared values are the uniting factor rather than an ethnicity, for example. So this is where the idea came from. But then obviously you need some economic factors baked into that as well. And reading Hoppe or reading Sovereign Individual, which made a huge impact on me personally, you start realizing that the world of today could be improved by a lot simply by changing a few variables in how societies are organized, right? And if you take a group of people, or a group of rootless men like myself, and unite them economically and ideologically, you can create these communities, cities, city-states, or citadels, as we like to call them, after the Bitcoin meme of several years ago. You can create these places. They're not utopias in any way. It's simply a city or a town or a community that has shared values and that has traditions and culture that they want to abide by. And there can be different types of citadels. There can be citadels based on common religious affiliations. There can be citadels based on common language, or simply citadels of theater lovers.
Right. And do you believe that might represent a security risk for let's say there's a lot of rich individuals in that town or in that citadel? Is that a security risk? Or do you think it's more like they would invest heavily into the security of that citadel?
I'm sure they will, especially if the citadel itself becomes a sovereign entity. Then you simply have to invest into defense systems. It can be actual physical borders and walls. It can be, you can hire contractors, military and defense contractors to guard you. But it's nothing new because right now I would argue that citadels already exist in some places, and actually American Hodl, who was on your podcast, mentioned one of these citadels, which is essentially a luxury community within a luxury community that is separated from the rest of the world by several walls, right? So they already exist. It's just more about formalizing them and maybe making them a little bigger, because it doesn't have to be a congregation of only rich men. Rich men can definitely be there, and if they are men of values, they can be the leaders of such citadels. But uh, the general populace is welcome as long as they agree to abide by the rules of the citadel, which, as far as I understand, men of values will create, in accordance with those values. It will be just a very, very natural private property respecting rules.
Right. And you mentioned Hans Hermann Hoppe, and I presume Democracy, the God That Failed, one of his well-known books. How did that book influence your view on citadels and, say, monarchy and anarcho-capitalism?
Yeah, well, I'm actually writing a piece right now that I will publish very soon. But essentially, the way I see democracy is that it's just an extension of the welfare state, of the socialist state, with a simple trick. And that trick is that through democratic elections, you make it look like people have a choice of their leaders, right? Which is completely false, of course, because through populism, through all kinds of manipulative tactics like propaganda, only the desired leaders end up at the top, right? And you don't really value skills and integrity in democracy. You only value skills like who is more clever, who is more like a snake, uh, can find their way to the top, right? Things like that. With democracy, the biggest problem is that there is absolutely no skin in the game for anybody who wants to be at the top of the pyramid, because the terms are very often limited. So, for example, in Russia, the term was 4 years, now it's 6 years, but it's still uh, the same limited term. And when you have only 4 years to spend trying to make a country better, you will not really try to do anything good for the country. You will try to use that time as efficiently as possible for yourself and to advance your own personal goals, right? Because it's similar to renting a house instead of living in one for the rest of your life, right? If you live in the house for the rest of your life, you tend to care about it more. You clean it more. You take care of the roof, of the windows. You take care of the backyard. Everything must look nice. When you rent it, you don't care that much because someone else will come after you and, they'll do the job probably. So this is where the idea comes here. So when you talk about monarchy, for example, obviously a monarch is someone who is attached physically to the piece of land that they own, right? And they live there for generations and generations. So if I had a piece of land that I know my children and grandchildren will live on, I will I will do my best to make sure that this piece of land develops really, really well. And if I have subjects, the population out there, I will do my best to make sure that they are happy and well fed and taken care of, because the well-being of such a state depends on the well-being of its citizenry.
Yeah. And so do you see it like so as I read it, Hopper's view is something like anarcho-capitalism, although he might use a different term. He might use the term private law society is his first best way of society organizing. And then in his view, he's saying monarchy is not as good as that, but it's still better, far better than democracy. And that's the argument you were aligned with what you were saying, and that's the argument Hans Hermann Hoppe makes. And so, in your view, is there like a tension there, or do you see it like Bitcoin Citadels of the future may have a kind of monarch, but you sort of opt in and opt out of it if the Citadel is a good one or a bad one?
I think the first thing that people need to understand is that in our case, in my case, monarchy is not prescriptive. It's more of a descriptive term. It's a term that describes a certain type of leadership, a hierarchy, if you will, because it's a simple law of nature that there's hierarchy in the world. There's the top and there's the bottom and there's the middle, right? So you don't have to call yourself a prince or a king. You can be the CEO, and the citadel can be owned by a property development corporation where you are chairman, right? So that is also a monarch. That is also a prince who makes most of the decisions, and he may have a board of directors to assist him in the decision-making process, right? So I don't think there is a conflict at all if because in the privacy of your own family, you can call yourself a king and no one's going to be really resisting, hopefully, right? Because it's just your own decision. It's just about titles. Just like in corporate environments, CEOs, CTOs, they are more or less just nomenclature. They are completely arbitrary. You can call yourself anything you want. This is an example. It's just monarchy and titles like the prince or king are quite lindy. They are quite awesome in their own way, and they also portray this feeling of tradition, right, and culture, where the monarch is usually the face of the nation. He represents the nation. He is always in public relationships, and people normally gather around the monarch and respect him. And one of my favorite examples of that is the Prince of Liechtenstein, whom people love very much.
Right, yeah, I think that's probably one of the best examples because, funnily enough, I think someone correct me if I'm mistaken, but I believe the Prince of Liechtenstein is actually a fan of Hans Hermann Hoppe and is actually friends with Hoppe, and like they actually talk about stuff. Yeah, so that's a really interesting example for listeners who want to understand a little bit more about how that could potentially be a thing in the future. And also, you mentioned The Sovereign Individual, which is a very well-read book within Bitcoin circles. One interesting point from that is this idea of the competitive tension, the competitive jurisdictions that over time we will see many, many city-states and they will compete to try and have visitors and people come and live there and then in doing so, they will have to compete on things like taxes, or in this world, it might be more like the costs, right? The price of coming to live in that citadel. Is that something you see applying into this idea of Bitcoin citadels?
Yeah, exactly. And such projects are already underway in some places, and there are groups of individuals and companies around the world who work to make this a reality, such as Titus Gebel's Free Private Cities project, which essentially is building a framework or a blueprint, if you will, for such a city state. then you take the blueprint, and if you find a territory on the planet that will, for example, within a nation or maybe a private island that will be suitable for such a project, you build it, right? So the issue here is not whether it's possible. The issue here is whether someone will actually do it. And I personally encourage as many of these, teams to actually start doing this and setting up these cities. So the more, the better, of course. As I tweeted once, I want to see a world of 1,000 Liechtensteins.
Right, right. And the question also is, does it turn on more funding? So essentially, do we need a couple more bull runs to make it happen, to make enough rich Bitcoiners, or can some Bitcoiners start it today?
Well, some Bitcoiners can start it today for sure. I would wait for another cycle or two so that we can see the creation of a more wealth transfer, basically, and the creation of more Bitcoin millionaires out there. Because not all Bitcoiners are there purely for money. Money is only great if you have the use for it, right? It's just a tool, a means to an end, and not the end itself. So if there are enough idealistic individuals like myself as well in the world, I think they will start it. Some will fail, some will not, but we will see a lot of these things happen because now we have this uncontrollable, uncensorable money, and suddenly not a single government can tell you what you can or cannot do with that money. If you feel like funding a crazy project, you just do it and you don't ask anybody.
I love that. Let's bring it back to OTC trading. So, do you have any? Just wondering if you've got any interesting stories that you could share with the listeners on, maybe any funny OTC deals, or maybe is it difficult to negotiate because sometimes you'll get some customer who feels like they should be getting a discount when they really should be paying a premium on the price and things like that?
Yeah, well, we did not really spend too much time in that type of OTC world, but we have had our fair share of experiences, and some of them essentially involve the scammers who, pretend to work for some billionaires, billionaire investors, and the obvious, rules is usually to meet in the physical world somewhere, on a neutral territory, or they will tell you that they will come to you, and they will explain to you how successful they are, how much money their investors have, and then on the spot they will require to do a test transaction of, let's say, 300,000 with cash. So that happened to us, yeah, and obviously being more or less experienced, we first of all we don't carry bitcoins on us ever, right? We don't sell this way because everything is done electronically with us. But yeah, we decided to give it a shot a couple of times, and both times it ended in that way. We decided not to deal with those types of OTC deals anymore because it's just not worth it. You spend a lot of time. People just waste a lot of your time on negotiations. At the end of the day, nothing happens. Right now, I would say the Bitcoin world needs reputable businesses that have just a good reputation because it's still about trust, no matter how you put it. If you want to buy Bitcoins from us, you still have to send money first and then expect Bitcoins in return, right? There is no way to do that other than, if you're extremely advanced and you have Bitcoin on the Liquid network and you have USDT Tether on the Liquid network, then you can launch this advanced atomic swap tool and do it in a no custodial way. But I think it's going to take another few years before all of this becomes the industry standard. So right now it's all based on trust, and we don't mind it because I like doing deals on trust, based on trust. It just builds relationships.
Right, right. And so in your brokerage, what are the sort of limits? Like what's the smallest deal you would do, and then what sort of size on the upper side would you do? Whatever you can disclose, that is.
Yeah, I mean, the minimum is normally 25,000, whether it's euros or US dollars, and there's really no maximum. And whenever people ask me what's your maximum, I know that they're not going to proceed with any deal because normally when such relationships start, you send, either the minimum, or if you are really loaded, you may send 100,000, then 200,000, then a million. But no one sends 50 million or 20 million in one shot. And it's like whoever tells you that they will is full of it.
Yeah, that's a good heuristic, I think. And so, do you get a lot of like new people coming to you for their first time if they're like a wealthy investor, or do they tend to be someone who's already gone for like an exchange, say, and bought a small amount there, and then they come to you for larger amounts on an OTC?
Yeah, I would say on average, our clients already know what they're doing most of the time. We do want to attract new investors, and we're really happy to talk to them and walk them through the process of how everything works, how to set up a wallet, and tell them, what custody solutions to use and what custody solutions already exist. But so far, based on the data, it's mostly experienced users.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay. And in terms of Liquid, so I know you have a product for Liquid as well. It's called Liquiditi with like ITI at the end. Tell us a little bit about that and why you started that.
Yeah, well, Liquidity was a fun project first. I just wanted to experiment with the Liquid network itself because we are a member of the Liquid Federation. So um, I saw no easy way to actually get Liquid BTC, which is the native token of the Liquid network that represents Bitcoin one to one. And the only way was through a couple of exchanges. But I don't want to register for an account at an exchange just to get some liquid bitcoins in exchange for real bitcoins. So I just decided to make a little tool for myself, and together with our developer, we spent a couple of weeks designing it, and then essentially uh, we decided to open it up to the public because we were getting requests on where do I get liquid BTC, right? So we decided to open it up, and suddenly it became quite popular. People are using it every single day. We are getting feature requests, and people already asking us to add more pairs like Tether, Liquid Canadian Dollar to the system. So and open up the API. So we're working on all that. I would say initially it was intended as a content or like value marketing strategy for us. Let's just create something valuable and let it, out there for free so that we can attract people to our main business, which is Bitcoin brokerage, right? But it looks like it's growing its own legs, and I love it personally.
Oh, that's cool. So, in your view, do you see a vector for the censorship there? That okay, so with Liquid, obviously, I see it's great for anyone who's a trader, anyone who's a broker, anyone who's an exchange trading amongst themselves and quickly moving bitcoins around using LBTC. Which what I'm getting at here is there's some debate in the community around things like how much of it is it an IOU? It's not Bitcoin itself, but at the same time, it can be useful as a tool for certain people. But then also the risk potentially, and this is probably the main one, is that your peg out of Liquid back into Bitcoin could get theoretically denied. And so, is that a risk that you see that people might be wary of, or do you see it like that is a risk that can be managed?
I think this is a risk that can be managed, but the first thing people need to understand is that LBTC is an IOU on Bitcoin. It is a token that represents Bitcoin, and it's not Bitcoin itself. Now, the difference between a centralized custody and custody on the Liquid network is that when you have a balance on Coinbase, for example, it's just a Coinbase that stores Bitcoin on your behalf. But when you have a balance on Liquid in the form of Liquid Bitcoin, it is a consortium of 15 members of the Liquid Federation that store your Bitcoin. It's a multi-sig wallet, and not a single player from the Federation can actually take your Bitcoins or deny you the peg out capabilities, right? So the vast majority of them actually have to agree on that. Now, there is a limitation on the amount of functionaries who can sign transactions on the Liquid network because of the technical limitations of the multi-sig wallet currently, right? But in the future, with so-called dynamic federations, the amount of functionaries can be increased dramatically, and federation will become more liquid, if you will, in terms of its members. Yeah. So, but that is not all, because if people are worried about not being able to peg out their liquid Bitcoin back into Bitcoin, as far as I remember, Blockstream is working on a self-peg out feature for users. So the average user will actually be able to self-peg out. It's going to be a slow process, like with pegging as well. But you will be able to request a self-peg out, and I believe, I'm not really sure how long it will take, probably a day or two. You will be able to get your Bitcoins back. So, you know, it's an early technology as well. It's in production. It works right now, and people use it right now, primarily businesses. But give it a little more time, just like with anything else, and I think it will prove itself.
Right. And I think nobody's really disputing the point that in a B2B sense, right? So traders, businesses, exchanges, absolutely, go for it. I think, the question here is more around should individuals be using it? And so long as they know what are the trade-offs they're making, they're entering into it with open eyes. And for some people, that's just not acceptable. They would never go there. But for many people, that is an acceptable trade-off that they would like to accept. Also wanted to talk about Moontower. So what's Moontower?
Well, we are in the high net worth brokerage business, but we also see quite a lot of opportunity in the retail space. And right now, what's getting really hot is the DCA bandwagon, right? So we actually decided to develop a DCA app months ago. It was at the end of summer, but we were engaged in other activities, and now we're fully onto it. So Moontower is a passive investment platform that you will be able to use to accumulate Bitcoin over time based on your settings. If you, for example, want to invest $100 per week, you will be able to do that with Moontower. And the service is primarily targeted at the European clients because we are licensed and based in Europe.
Fantastic. So what's the expected timeline for Moontower?
I'd like to say as soon as it's ready, but within a few weeks, yeah, I would really like it to happen, especially now that the halving is coming in. And we may not see the FOMO right away, but it would be really nice to position ourselves at that time.
Yeah. And I guess the other question from a Europe perspective, there are some businesses who recently faced trouble there in terms of AML D5, AML, I think Directive 5 or whatever. There were some businesses, I believe in the Netherlands. So Bitter, Ruben, unfortunately said he wasn't able to comply, so he's choosing to shut down the business. Is that a risk that you see for yourself, or is it more like you believe you'll be able to handle that compliance workload or burden?
Yeah, well, we are already a licensed business and we comply with all the KYC AML regulations already. It is true that the regulations are getting a little tougher, and that is the primary risk. The primary risk is not the regulations themselves, but uncertainty around the regulations. For example, when we started our company in Estonia, regulations were a lot softer, but right now, due to those soft regulations, a lot of unsavory characters got licenses and took advantage of that loophole, so to speak. And the government wasn't really happy about that, so they decided to really crack down on those businesses and increase the amount of hurdles that people have to go through to get the license. And we've had the license all this time, but we still have to comply with their additional requirements that are coming this summer. We'll handle it because we're in there for the long haul. But we definitely see a lot of companies from European jurisdictions like Estonia, Malta. They just drop out and they decide to move or shut down.
Yeah. Well, we'll see how that all plays out. So, in terms of listeners who want to find you online, let's say they're a listener and they want to get an OTC deal with you, or they're interested in Moontower, or they want to follow your Bitcoin Reserve Journal, where can they find you online?
Well, my personal blog is degaia.co. The Twitter is y_degaia. And you can find all our projects, business projects, at L2B.global. That's where all of them are listed. We'll be happy to answer any questions. There you go.
Fantastic. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Stefan. Glad to be here.
I hope you enjoyed the show, and just a quick request before I let you go. I'm looking to try and start doing some more live video interviewing, so I will be doing some more interviews on my YouTube channel. So please go and subscribe, youtube.com/Stefan Livera. Of course, I will put those interviews onto the SLP audio stream, and you'll definitely want to subscribe because my next coming interview is with Plan B and Safedine. Find the show notes and transcript at stefanlivera.com, and I'll see you in the Citadels.